All right, well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar about accessing federal funds for arts education. We hope that you'll get a lot out of this from whatever perspective you are coming from as it relates to arts education, whether you are in the classroom, an administrator, a policymaker, or if you are coming to us from the nonprofit arts world. We really hope that we're going to be able to find some things that are of value to you. So just briefly, just kind of a lay of the land, what we're going to discuss tonight. We're going to do a brief review of what is ESSA. If you don't know what that is, we'll do the overview. What funds are available through ESSA and how can they be used? And then we live in the world of acronyms, of course. So what is ESSER and what are those funds and how can they be used? And then I think the real meat of the discussion here is then how do we all think creatively about how we use these funds? And then, of course, some question and answer at the end. So if you have any questions as we're going along, feel free to put them in the chat, but we will have an opportunity at the end for a little bit open discussion for anyone who would like to pose any questions at that point. So just as a means of quick introductions for your presenters tonight. So my name is Mark Espetakis. I am the Director of Public and Government Affairs for the Pennsylvania Music Educators Association. We're hosting this webinar tonight, but of course, this is not just about music, it's about all areas of arts education. I started at PMEA in December of 2020. So I've been on the job about 7 months or so, 7 or 8 months, and really working in the areas of advocacy and influencing policy and those types of things, and working with our membership to raise the level of music education in their communities. And I am so thrilled to be joined by Dustin Lohr from Arizona. And Dustin, I'll let you do your own introduction.
Awesome. Good afternoon and good evening to my East Coast friends. It's only 4 o'clock over here in the desert, so we're a little bit before you all, but I'm happy to be here with you all and having this wonderful conversation. This is actually the second time I've presented with Mark, so I'm looking forward to talk about federal funding and opportunities to think creatively with these dollars to activate arts education in our schools, regardless of where you are in the nation. I serve as the Director of Arts Education and Title IV-A with the Arizona Department of Education. Underneath my purview is well-rounded education activities, safe and healthy students, and the effective use of technology. So I'm really happy to be here and talk federal funding. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to have Dustin with us because he is in the department and he is living this and seeing this on a daily basis. So his perspective is incredibly valuable to us. So I thank him for being here. So let's do a little bit of brief history here. The Every Student Succeeds Act, what we know as ESSA. So this is just my favorite picture ever of the signing of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And usually I do a quiz and say, who is this and who is he with? But I'll spare that tonight and just put it on the screen for you. That is President Lyndon Johnson with one of his former teachers, which helps to explain his focus and why he found music education, but education to be so important. Sorry about that. The brief history here of the law and how we got here. So back in 1965, the nation's education law was signed into place, which is what you're seeing in that picture, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESSA. First passed in 1965. As I always say, think back to the 60s. It was civil rights was the issue of the day. And that's what this law was about, equal access to education for all children. It wasn't about testing and the things that we may think of when we think about federal policy now. It was about equal access. So that original law through the years has been reauthorized in different ways. And every time that it's reauthorized, there's a new acronym that we have to learn that is part of it. But essentially what is happening is that we are just changing ESSA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The one that most of us are very familiar with is what we saw happen in 2001, which was No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind, many prescriptive federal requirements, lots of, I wouldn't say lots, but there were good things in NCLB. There were also bad things. The problem was folks couldn't agree on how do we fix it. So there were some workarounds that happened that came out of the Obama administration from the Federal Department of Education that was kind of workarounds for states and schools. But the law needed reauthorized, and it took quite a number of years for that to happen. So along comes 2015 before the previous presidential administration. And the thought was, okay, if anything's going to happen as far as reauthorizing it, it makes sense to do it before an election year, because nothing happens in Washington in an election year. And depending on who the new president would be, you don't know if education is going to be a priority of that administration. So during 2015, there was a lot of talk and a lot of hope that something would happen. And then what did happen is what many folks refer to as the Christmas miracle, because in December of 2015, ESSA was signed into law. And it shifted much of the federal authority that we had seen under NCLB to the states. So the states had a lot more flexibility on how they could do things. There were still, of course, some federal requirements, but the states really had now the ability to go and do what was right, or what they felt was right in their own states. And districts also then had a little bit more leeway. So it's not worth reading the whole law because it's hundreds of pages. I've done it. Maybe Dustin has done it as well. But one of the areas of the law that's really important. So Title 8 of the law, essentially Chapter 8 of the law, defines well-rounded education, and we'll explain why that's so important here in a minute. But it defines well-rounded education, and it lists the subjects that are included in well-rounded education. The arts had previously been listed as a core subject under No Child Left Behind. That terminology went away, and we came up with, well, we didn't, but the law came up with well-rounded education, left the word arts in there, but also included the word music. So what that means is then anywhere in the law that we see the term well-rounded, it means all of these subject areas. So here in Pennsylvania, I know we have some folks from other states, but there's mostly Pennsylvania folks. I want to emphasize this. So what happened was when ESSA was signed into law, states then had to say, okay, we have to come up with our own plan of how this will be enacted in our state. So in Pennsylvania, there's a plan. You can go to PDE's website and see it. But this is a really key piece in there that we always like to highlight. That the department says that, I mean, you can read it on the screen, of course, what is bolded, that all students have access to opportunities to participate in the arts and music and other disciplines that spark joy and creativity. To us, that's a major win, because that is policy-wise saying to school districts, you know, we are here to support you and let you understand that the arts and music are part of what ESSA can do. And that is really important. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dustin right now to talk about Title I of the law. We could say Chapter 1 of the law, and what that means for school programs.
Thanks, Mark. I also really quickly just dropped in the chat for those of you who are attending from Arizona. We are in the process of updating our Arizona State ESSA plan, and there are changes that are impacting Title 4A and well-rounded education, and we are still in the public comment portion of these adjustments. We actually will be hosting a final webinar the end of July or early August. So if you're interested in learning more about that, shoot me an email. That information is in the chat. Okay, so Title 1A. When we think of federal funding, many of us are familiar or have heard of Title I, or low funding that is specifically designated to support low-income students. Title I has been around for a long time, and it's supplemental funding to help offset the barriers and the challenges that our low-income students and families face. Title 1A has in the past, under No Child Left Behind, been able to fund arts education, but under the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to ESSA, the opportunities to fund the arts through Title I has increased. Again, as Mark said, because we are looking at the idea of providing well-rounded education to our students. Now, honestly, if you leave here with nothing but this idea of capturing onto well-rounded education, I think we have been successful. Well-rounded education under the Every Student Succeeds Act is an extremely important definition for the arts, because it's the idea of well-rounded education is actually centered in student access and opportunity, which is defined as a student's civil right. And that's really important for us to recognize that the arts being defined as a well-rounded education subject is essentially being equated to a student's civil right. And that's huge. Because of that, the arts can be funded in and of themselves. So what that means is, if there is not an arts program happening at a school in any of the artistic subjects, you can utilize federal funding to create that opportunity for students, because the whole point of well-rounded education is increasing access and increasing opportunity. So if a school is lacking arts programming, federal funding can be used to create that artistic opportunity. Now, if we're using Title I funding to create that artistic opportunity, then that opportunity would only be for those students who qualify as low-income students. So that's sort of the caveat there. Title I funding can go toward a teacher's salary. It could go toward a nonprofit coming in and providing arts instruction to students in a residency format, either before school or after school or during school. It could be used to provide access for potentially field trips. That might be a little bit more of a stretch under Title I, but certainly allowable under Title IV. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit more as we go through the presentation. But the big thing to note with Title I funding is that this funding is truly designated for our low-income students. And there are two classifications of a Title I program. There is a school-wide program or a targeted assistance program. And essentially what that means is, if a school is operating a school-wide program, then a high percentage of that school's population qualifies as low income. So if they have a Title IA grant, they can service a larger population of their school environment. If they are running a targeted assistant program, that means that a smaller percentage of their students qualify as Title IA or low income, and therefore anything funded out of Title I through a targeted program can only support those low income students. Mark, does that help kind of introduce us to Title I at a baseline level without going into the weeds?
Yeah, I think that's perfect. And it's important to note that, yes, can be used for the arts, and those in the nonprofit space can think about where they fit in here.
Absolutely.
But important to note that the money goes to LEAs, which are local education agencies, and then they would then dole that funding out. It would not go directly from the federal government or a state department of education to a nonprofit.
That's correct. And I apologize for the acronym. For those of you who might not be familiar, an LEA, or a local education agency, includes all traditional public schools as well as public charter schools. So we call them a local education agency because it encompasses both districts and public charters.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit here about Title IV, Title IV Part A. So I'm going to go through this part, but Dustin, feel free to jump in on any of this, because this is your wheelhouse every day. So we're looking at ESSA, right? So we talked about Title I. Now we're talking about Title IV. Okay, so Chapter 4. So here's the takeaways. The funds in this area can be used for three main areas: provide all students access, important word, access to a well-rounded education. So again, that well-rounded definition is very important. So I see well-rounded anywhere, and to me, that means arts and music. That's how I read it, because that's part of that definition. Improve school conditions for student learning in safe and healthy schools, really important. The effective use of technology. And it's really important to have the word effective in there, because if we go back and look at what was happening before ESSA, money was doled out for technology, and a lot of that technology is sitting in closets in schools because the technology was purchased, but nobody actually knew how to use said technology, because that support was not actually required as part of it. And there was kind of this race for technology in schools, it seemed. To receive Title I money, your LEA, school district, charter school, whatever, has to receive Title I funds. Then that money can go out to non-Title I schools. So, the inside baseball term is the non-pub share, meaning that then if there's a non-public school in an LEA in a school district, they are entitled to a piece of that puzzle, a piece of that money, and it comes from the local education agency, the public entity receiving the money. One of the other interesting things, and maybe Dustin, you might want to comment on this, is that the parts for well-rounded education, which is we're not going to dive into specific percentages or anything here, but that's a big bucket of the funds that are available as part of Title IV. They are not subject to evidence-based requirements, and that's really I think a value, because an arts educator can say, look, I have this innovative idea and I think that this can work, and I'm coming to you with a plan of how this can work. You don't have to go out and find research that says it will work. Is that a fair definition, Dustin?
Yes, absolutely. And I think even for our nonprofit friends that are on this call, this is a huge opportunity for you. Because a lot of the times you do have anecdotal information that shows that your programming does produce results. You might have some numbers, you might have a general idea that what you're doing is successful, and that can suffice as, quote, evidence. And under the ESSA tiers of evidence, you can say, look, we have this inkling, we have this idea, this is what we plan to implement, this is how we're going to track our progress and demonstrate results. And that's enough. That's a fundable activity under ESSA. Previously, under No Child Left Behind, if you were going to use federal funding to activate anything, including the arts, it had to have evidence that showed that it would improve student academic performance. And that was where it was really challenging for us to fund the arts, because at the time, there wasn't a ton of evidence that said, yes, this drama program was going to improve student academic performance in ELA or math. That correlation data was hard to come by. Possible, but harder. Under ESSA, we have the opportunity to experiment and innovate.
So let's talk about, okay, they're talking about this money and stuff, but what are some actual ideas? What are ways that this money can be used? So I'm going to give you some examples, and these are real world examples of a survey that we did here in Pennsylvania 2 years ago. And we went out to schools that we knew received this ESSA money and used it for the arts. So real world examples. Equipment. I mean, that's pretty much that's the first thing that folks think about. We had an instance where it was a shared piece of equipment, which is what helped to get the idea.
Stop with the ball.
Which is what helped to get the idea across about sharing, and it was well-rounded, and it was access, because it was access for more students beyond just one area. Additional instruments to fill the gap of students that just don't have access to instruments is something else that also happened. Again, access is another important word here. Supplemental instruction. A school had a new band director coming in, so they the district used some of their money to have a camp situation where they brought the band students in earlier than they normally would to meet this band director and have some time with him as a way to build the program. A drama camp where a school, I believe the situation was they did not necessarily do a musical, or if they did, it was a smaller scale. They decided we want to expose our students to not just the musical style that we are doing in our annual spring musical. We want to expose them to different styles of drama. So they were able to do a drama camp, which was an extra thing for those students that was exposing them to different things. So there's a place where I could see the nonprofit community can come in and say, yes, this is something that we can offer to your school because this is something that's in our wheelhouse and that we work in. A pilot theater program with a community theater. This is where they took second graders to theatrical performances, and we've heard of that before. Certainly in our area, it's the second grade or third grade always goes to symphony performances, but part of their focus was we're going to talk to them about the theater performance, but we're going to tie in audience behavior and expectations. And I just love that piece because to me that's just tying in to be a well-rounded citizen, and that's part of one of the goals of ESSA. So some experiences, again, they could use it for trips to the symphony, bringing in a visiting artist. Professional development can be included here. So professional development is its own area of ESSA, Title II. We're not going to dive into that, but there are ways that professional development can happen and be paid for under Title IV. Either way, it doesn't matter necessarily when you're making the ask if you're saying it's going to come from Title II or Title IV at this point. But if, let's say you're a nonprofit and feel that you can provide some value professional development to a school, you can go and work with those educators, and those educators can work up the line and say, okay, how do we fund this? And in a couple of minutes, we're going to talk about that. How do you do this? How do you look for the funding? So stay tuned for that. Equitable course offerings across the district. Elementary School A has a large music library. Elementary School B does not. So we can see that there now is the offering in the course is not equitable. But let's say that Elementary School A offers beginning band starting in 4th grade, but Elementary School B doesn't offer it till 5th or 6th grade. This money can be used to then provide access and equitable access, and that's what happened here. In some instances, an additional teacher can be used, which is, as Dustin mentioned, can happen under Title I as well. I always say that Title IV can be tricky. And Dustin, if you want to weigh in here, I always say Title IV can be a little bit tricky because each year you're going back to the well and saying, okay, I want to use the money for this. The funds are not renewable necessarily for the same project from year to year. So it's just a little trickier to use this funding for teachers under Title IV. Is that a fair definition?
I think, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but when we look at funding anything with federal funding, including Title IV, we have to go back to the original need. What is the need? And so when it comes to funding something from one year to the next, if the LEA is able to demonstrate that the need is still there, we still have this need, we still need this teacher, and the only way to get access to this teacher is by using Title IVA funds, and they can make that justification, then they should be okay to, again, continuously use Title IVA funding for this salaried position. I think it's definitely doable. We see a lot of that in Arizona. We do fund teachers. But again, it is a federal funding source and it is subject to congressional approval. So that is something to always think about before you fund a salaried position out of any federal funding source.
Okay, yeah, important, good clarification. Thank you. Performance-based upgrades, can be used for that. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Here is one of my favorite ones that happened in Pennsylvania. And I'm going to actually show you a video that explains this a little bit. But it was an art project where they brought in a visiting artist, and in conjunction with this, there was professional development for the school art teacher that happened offsite. There was a community history lesson for the students, some assemblies for the students, and then the culmination of this was this large artwork that was then placed outside of the school, and it tied into the history of the community. And they were able to use some of this this federal ESSA money in addition to some local arts education agency funding. And so I'm going to show you a video about that in a second, but this, to me, this was actually one of our very first examples in Pennsylvania of Title IV funds. And I just, to me, I mean, it's amazing. One of the first ones to me is still kind of the shining light is the best one. But I think the point is, and we'll discuss this more in a second, it really is about having a conversation and doing that needs assessment. And we'll talk about what that needs assessment is and what that means in a second. So I am going to, we're going to play just a little bit of this video. So this is that project that I was referring to.
Danville is a small town in central Pennsylvania. It's located along the Susquehanna River in the lower Appalachian Mountains. Danville's Montour Iron Works was one of the first American producers of the T-rail, the development of which helped grow 19th century America's burgeoning steam train transportation system. And Danville once had an iron forge, located where the middle school stands now, which employed over 1,800 men. The Danville Primary School has a positive behavior program called Iron Kids, calling attention to the town's past as a major iron producer and encouraging the kids to show admirable qualities, such as integrity, respect, and kindness. To highlight their commitment to these qualities, Danville decided they wanted a sculpture built for the front of the primary school, a scale model of an 1800s era narrow gauge steam engine. That's when they contacted Doug Firestone. Doug is a blacksmith, a gunsmith, and a metalworker, and had demonstrated his artisan work at Danville's annual Iron Heritage Festival. So the district contacted Doug and asked him, could he make them a train? Well, Doug jumped at the chance, and the district, along with the local arts council, hired him as their visiting artist for 2018. Doug would not only sculpt the train, he would visit the primary school for a week and teach the children his craft in their art classes. The district wanted the students to get to know Doug ahead of time, so the art teacher traveled to his artisan shop in the Pennsylvania mountains to interview him before his visit.
So I'm going to stop it there and leave that as a bit of a teaser for you, but it's on YouTube. There's actually, I believe, a series of 3 videos with Doug. If you just look up Doug Firestone, Danville Area School District, you'll find the videos. There's a long interview with him. There's a pieces of how this happened in the school. I just think it was a wonderful project, and I would encourage you to check it out. And it really just it encompasses so many things coming together. I love the history piece of it and how that plays into what they're showing the students in the school. So that there are some ideas for you on how money can be used, and believe me, there's a lot more that aren't listed that I'm sure that you could think of. But how do you go about asking for that money, and how do you go about making the justification? So Dustin, you're the person who sits at that seat in Arizona, who's on the receiving end of those asks. I think you're the right person to explain this part.
Absolutely. And we're going to kind of go a little bit deeper into this later on into the presentation. But when we think about our ask, there's kind of 2 different approaches that I see utilized most often. The first being looking at the needs of your program, and in this case, we're talking about arts programming, and trying to figure out how to activate these funds to address your own programmatic needs directly. Another method, which we're going to go into in a little bit more detail here in a few minutes, is how looking at the identified needs of the school or the district and trying to determine how you can situate the arts as the solution to whatever the need that might be identified by the district stakeholders. This first slide that we're looking at here is looking at how we can bring our needs as arts educators to the table. And one way to do that, a way that I think is already created for you by our professional service organizations, is something called the Opportunity to Learn standards. So the Opportunity to Learn standards are a set of standards that were created by each of the artistic disciplines. We have a set for music, for visual art, for dance, and for theater that allows it sets up a roadmap for you to conduct a needs assessment of your own artistic programming at a school site or even at a district. It's a relatively straightforward process. The standards guides you through everything from materials and equipment and space to looking at the instructional time that is allotted to the arts, to the master scheduling, to teacher staff availability and all of that, teacher-student ratios. This is a wonderful tool for you to utilize. You can go into the Opportunity to Learn standards, go through the entire process, and then bring those standards to your principal or your district representation. Depending on your strategy, it's important to recognize that the Title IV-A grant is a district grant. So the person who might have the closest access to those funds might reside at your district office. They'll probably be a federal programs director or perhaps a associate superintendent over curriculum and instruction, something like that. They would be the person that you could talk to. Your principals may or may not know that their art programming is being funded out of Title IV. Some districts are very transparent with where funding is coming from. Other districts are like, hello, Principal A, here's your budget for your arts programming, and they don't say that it's coming from Title IV. So your principal may or may not know about Title IV. Don't be discouraged if they don't. Try to find out who at the district does know. If you're going to go about this through Title I, your principal will is much more likely to have a intimate understanding of what their Title I budget looks like, because they are directly responsible for the planning process of Title I programming.
Okay, so that's a really good overview, and we're going to talk a little bit more detail later about, how do you think through that process of Dustin mentioned two key words, the needs assessment. And we'll talk more about what that means a little bit later, but let's mentally shift now. So we're talking ESSA, we're talking the federal education law and how it doles out money, okay? We're going to shift now, and we're moving to another acronym here. We're going to move to talk about ESSER. So ESSER is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. Okay, so you see I have ESSER 1 listed. What is this? Well, this is essentially the COVID money. This is federal stimulus dollars that have been doled out because of COVID. So I'm going to go through this pretty briefly, just so you kind of get a broad sense of this. The point I think of all of this ESSER talk, from my perspective, is that there's a lot of money and we have a little bit of time to spend it. So decisions don't need to be made immediately. So the thinking here is, yes, a needs assessment idea for sure, but also the thinking is kind of long-term, and are we building back a program? What can we do to add to what we have that may have been damaged by COVID? So, okay, so ESSER was part of what we knew as the CARES Act. So this is what happened very quickly after COVID hit in March of 2020. So the over $30 billion was put into what was known as this Education Stabilization Fund. 13.2 billion, this is from the federal government, went to ESSER. The rest went to higher education, and then the governors, the GEAR funds, and the governors then had the option to say how they were going to use that money in their states. The funds are distributed in the same proportion as Title IV Part A, but you heard Dustin talk earlier about some of the rules that are necessary with Title I allocations. This money doesn't have to live under those same rules. It's just distributed in the same way. Funds must be obligated starting back in March 13th, that very famous Friday in 2020 that we all remember very well, through September of 2022. They must be obligated. That does not mean they have to be spent. That means there has to be a plan for what the money will be used for. The check doesn't necessarily have to be written. So there's a little bit of time left still here on this initial ESSER fund if an LEA has not spent that money. And then states must award the funds to a school within a year of receiving them, which would mean by now, and that would have happened in your state. Okay, ESSER 2. So this is that second relief bill that happened in December of 2020. So it changed some things of the CARES Act, which was that the bigger act that ESSER 1 came out of. And it said, all right, we're going to give another $54.3 billion to ESSER. So a district can't start spending this amount of money until they spend ESSER 1 funds. And then the obligation period goes for another year. So ESSER 2 was into 2022. This is into 2023. And again, states have to award the funds to school within a year of receiving them. What was a little bit different here in ESSER 2 is that instead of in ESSER 1, if a remember I mentioned earlier the non-public share through Title IV funds, an LEA would distribute that to a non-public school. ESSER 1, it was the same thing. ESSER 2 changed that. There's a separate program of funds that would go to non-public schools. So then there's the American Rescue Plan, which we can call ARP, we can call ESSER 3. There's just so many acronyms, right, in the last year. So the American Rescue Plan provided $129 billion for education. I can't stress enough that we will never, I can't imagine we will ever see this type of money coming into education again in any of our careers, this mass infusion. So at least 90% of the funds for this third round will go to LEAs, public school districts and charter schools. And again, using that Title I-A allocation formula. So this money is a little bit more specific in how it's targeted. It's targeted the idea of learning recovery, summer enrichment, after school programs. So I'm thinking, if you're in the nonprofit community, after school programs are certainly a place where you would be able to fit in there. And then some other areas, but those are the three major ones. So what happened was 2/3 of this funding was immediately available to states, and then the rest of it will be made available after the states submit their ESSER implementation plans, which were actually, I believe, due June 7th, but it's not everybody submitted on time, and there are still states that have not submitted their ESSER plan. In fact, I believe Pennsylvania's is just in draft form at this point. And now schools have until 2024 for this piece of the fund. So ESSER 1 is still 2022, ESSER 2 is 2023, ESSER 3 here is until 2024. So talking about how much money this is, as you can see, a huge amount of money coming, billions of dollars coming to Pennsylvania through these three ESSER funding opportunities. and it doesn't include what the state set aside. So the state is allowed to take some of this money and set it aside for some type of statewide programs. If you're interested in how you can find out any of those specific amounts, you can just send an email to us at advocacy@pmea.net, and we can point you in that direction. Okay, so let's, I mentioned this before, federal investment likely the largest we'll ever see. In some cases, it's 4 to 5 times what an LEA would regularly receive. Again, we're still talking these relief funds. There's still a possibility that an infrastructure plan that has been talked around in Washington, D.C. could add more money for schools, specifically targeted at school infrastructure. There's been some discussion that the plan would be very broad and just say to schools, okay, you can use this for infrastructure. There have been other pieces of the discussion that say, we would give you this money, but it's only going to be for certain things in school buildings. But again, not been passed in any way yet. I always caution folks that with any piece of the federal
I got the
funds,
message, but I'm doing a
schools
webinar right
shouldn't
now.
necessarily consider these funds always as recurring expenses. And especially the ESSER funds, because we have the defined endpoint of them. And then the federal government has spelled out 12 areas for uses of the funds. And one of them is areas already available under ESSA. So everything we talked about, Title I, Title IV, these funds can be used there. And as I always say, as a reminder, think about the well-rounded piece. And just as a little bit of a side note, here in Pennsylvania, as far as our state budget goes, there was a $200 million increase to schools in the amount of money that they received from Pennsylvania as part of the basic education funding, and then a separate $100 million going to, as they're calling it, a level up program that is designed to give money to schools that have the most need for money. So again, really important investment in education of about $300 million this year. And I do like to remind people in some instances, you know, that if you look at all of this money, if you look at the ESSA money, you look at the ESSER money, and in Pennsylvania, you look at the increase in our budget line item to education, that funding might not necessarily be the obstacle in the immediate future into the next school year. Scheduling may be, as remediation in other subject areas may take precedence in some schools, at least in the minds of administrators, over arts courses. And so that is something that we all need to be mindful of in schools. Talking a little about how you can use this money. The goal of this ESSER money, again, we're talking about the relief funds, is to address learning loss during the pandemic. So some of these are music specific, but you can substitute the word arts in there. In school or after school music education, arts programming, a learning camp to address learning loss. I just think that is such a key piece of what the legislation talked about, was this idea of enrichment. So a camp to address learning loss in the arts, because we know that happened in the last year. Software that would assist with, you know, to make any transition potentially from in-person, hybrid, or remote easier. Facility repairs, including proper ventilation, sanitizing supplies, PPE, and again, hopefully we're beyond a really, really great need for these types of things as we are hopefully moving post-COVID. But that's going to be different in every area of the country and then individual areas of states. Purchase or rental of instruments for students that are unable to attain them, so that they would avoid sharing instruments. Professional development for educators to talk about in-person learning in a safe way, another place where nonprofits, I think, could get involved. Materials needed to set up a classroom. So those are just some ideas that I would throw out there. Again, I think you can come up with many of your own ideas. And also, if you're interested, again, send us an email and we can get you the list of all of those 12 ESSER areas that can be funded, but it is truly pretty broad. So I'm going to send it over to Dustin now to talk about process of your thinking here when you're asking for these funds, be it ESSA funds or ESSER funds, because I think a lot of the thinking is the same way. So Dustin?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've sort of mentioned this a few times already, but the very first thing that you're going to need to do to access any federal funding for your artistic programming is to come up with a plan. And before you start with that plan, you need to conduct that needs assessment. In Arizona, we call this a comprehensive needs assessment, and we'll go into that a little bit in just a moment. But you need to start with what are your needs? And again, we have that kind of two-pronged approach. You could either look directly at the needs for your artistic programming, or you can enter the room and listen to the needs that the principals and the school leaders are talking about and figure out how the arts can perhaps be the solution to that identified need. So once you have your needs assessment completed, you will generate a plan that will be utilized to address those needs. And that's where kind of the details come into play. What are the specific expenditures that we're looking at? What are the staff requirements? What are the time requirements? What are the material requirements? Depending on the funding source that you're trying to activate, you will need differing levels of detail. And I don't want to know, Mark, if we should go into the weeds right now regarding that. We talked about how Title IV expenditure requests might look a little bit different than ESSER funding expenditure requests. When you're looking at ESSER funding, the devil is really in the details. They're going to need to know earlier per unit costs. So if you're going to try to fund an after-school art program and you need to purchase painting kits for every single student, having that cost breakdown right away is really important when you're thinking about accessing ESSER funding. And the reason is because states are trying to figure out how to appropriately implement these funds and to verify expenditures. And they don't want to create a situation where a year or 2 years from now, there's an audit finding at the district level or the school level, and they're going to have to return these funds, right? So they want those details ahead of time and sooner. Whereas with our standard ESSA funding, Title I or Title IV, we might have a little bit more time to negotiate those details with you. So those are some items and some strategies to think about. And finally, it's about sharing your plan. It's about talking to not only other arts educators, but also other folks within the education ecosystem. You might figure out an innovative way that you can collaborate with your physical education teachers on campus and create a whole family wellness seminar that encompasses perhaps school nutrition and artistic programming. That could be funded through any of these funding sources that we're talking about. Family and community engagement is a very big need, especially post-COVID. So collaborate, work together, and think creatively. As Mark said, a lot of our districts with our ESSER funding are getting 4, 5 times amount of money what they're typically getting. And right now is the time to dream big, shoot for the stars, and ask your asks. The other thing to note, as we said, and I dropped it in the chat, our ESSA 3 funding, your obligations have to be made by 2024. So ask now for this money. Ask in the winter for this money, ask in the summer for this money, ask next school year for this money. Keep asking. You might get, the first time that you ask, you might hear, oh, our plan has been submitted. It's in the state's hands now. Okay, that's true. But because these funds are going to be obligated over such a long period of time, revisions are going to be made. There's always going to be an opportunity for you to ask again and hopefully get your artistic programming either funded because you're addressing an identified need, or your arts programming needs directly funded through one of these funding sources. So Mark, if you hit the next button, I wanted to show just an example of the comprehensive needs assessment that we have in Arizona. So in order for our schools to access their federal funding, they must complete an annual comprehensive needs assessment every single year. And what they do is they actually look at all of their school's needs through these 6 principles. And they do this on an annual basis, and they have to show the state documentation that they have done this process. Now, if I was at the district level, what I would be doing on an annual basis is collecting all of my school's comprehensive needs assessments. I would analyze each and every one of them to determine what my district needs are. How am I going to use my district funds to support the schools and the needs that they have shared with us? And that is what's necessary for our districts in order to activate their Title IV-A allocation. They have to create their district plan that is built upon the comprehensive needs assessments that their schools submit to them. And I just wanted to share this with you because, again, to reiterate, needs assessments are happening continuously throughout the year. This is a living document. It's not a one and done situation. Needs are constantly evolving. They are constantly changing. And the applications that we look at every single day in Title IV, they're getting revised all the time. Right now, my staff is looking at funding applications in Title IV from last year, as well as from this current school year that we're projecting forward. And in last year's applications, we have some grants that have been revised 8, 9 times. So anytime that a grant is revised, the need is also revised. So there's an opportunity for you in the arts to situate your need or to become the solution to a need on a continual basis. And another part that's required in this whole needs assessment process is stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement is required. A lot of times we have, specifically with our Title IV-A application, because it's a district level grant, we will run into situations where we have determined that the needs assessment or the stakeholders that were engaged were the superintendent, a principal, and a discipline coordinator. That's not full engagement. Take a look at this list, folks. Each federal funding area has a specific group of stakeholders that should be engaged in the planning process. And that's on a continual basis. And that engagement might look very different. It could be anything from a survey response to roundtables, to a quarterly update, to regular and continual consultation. I highlighted a couple of areas here specifically for our nonprofit friends that are with us today. Our nonprofits are included as a stakeholder that should be considered when districts and schools are conducting their needs assessment. You are a valuable member of our community, and you bring valuable resources to our students and schools. And if you are engaging and involved with the comprehensive needs assessment process, you can bring solutions that independently our school leaders might not recognize. If you can hit next for me, Mark, that'd be great. So what does that mean? Like I said, there's lots of different ways that engagement might look. It could be, it's a spectrum, right? We could have just you coming in and informing the district of opportunities that you might be able to provide, all the way up to like collaborating meaningfully and continually with our districts and our school leaders. So there's quite a spectrum for what this engagement looks like. But because of that spectrum, there is an opportunity for some really innovative solutions to be identified.
So we've thrown out a lot of information here tonight, and truly this is a really broad overview of ESSA and ESSER funds. And I think the goal here was to kind of get you thinking about these funds and realizing, boy, there's a lot of money. And let's see if we can't find a way to take advantage of that. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And I'm going to say, if anyone has a question, feel free to throw that out here. I know we're approaching the top of the hour, but happy to answer any questions here. But we'll also, Dustin's email is in the chat, and I will also put our PMEA email if you have any questions. But are there any questions anyone wants to ask right now? We will also send out a recording of this to all of you tomorrow. So you will have this. Let me, I was lucky enough to have a great discussion with Dustin about all this a couple of weeks ago. Let me, I'll throw out a couple things that maybe he'd be willing to discuss from his wonderful purchase, someone that's approving this. You talked a little bit about this tonight, but I know we have a lot of nonprofit folks here. What's their perspective coming into this? What should they be thinking when they're saying, boy, I have a program that would work with a school? What's the thinking they should have?
So a lot of times the needs assessments that our schools and our districts are required to submit to the state, a lot of times these are publicly available. Now, just because something is publicly available doesn't mean that it's easy to get to. You might have to find your Department of Education representative to connect with, but if you can get a hold of a district's needs assessment or a school's needs assessment, you as a nonprofit can see what the challenges are that the individual schools or districts that you are trying to partner with are facing every single day. And for example, if let's say, you got a hold of a district's needs assessment and you see that one of their identified needs was bullying interventions. Like there's a lot of bullying happening across their campuses. It's an identified problem. It's impacting learning, and they're trying to address that bullying issue. How can you as an arts nonprofit leverage your artistic programming to address that bullying challenge, right? If you can come up with a programming, or maybe you already have a programming, as we know, the arts and social emotional learning are inherently connected, and you can pitch that programming to the district as a bullying intervention. One of the slides that we had up there, I think with your introduction to Title 4A, Mark, was that Title IV can fund well-rounded education, safe and healthy students, and the effective use of technology. The arts can be supported in any of those three categories, right? I see a lot of artistic programming happening in Arizona that is not connected to well-rounded education as the bucket, but is actually under safe and healthy students. Districts are saying that the arts are improving conditions for learning. They're improving the culture and climate of their campuses. They are enhancing parent and family engagement. All of those are technically categorized as a safe and healthy activity. So when you're thinking of how you can use activate these dollars and how your programming might be that solution, think creatively, because a lot of times there is a federal funding source that can be utilized to provide support.
Are there any other questions that anyone has here right now?
Mark, this is
John.
John Amoroso. I know Dustin. We're from a foundation in Arizona that supports youth access to the arts, and I've pitched this to arts nonprofits for 3 years now as this like massive untapped source of funding for. And it's also a challenge. It's a local organizing challenge. It's, becoming familiar with the schools, the needs, and building that relationship. And like, I think the last thing you would want would be, to have, 5 nonprofits walk through the door with their plan and have them shut the door and say, they're just trying to come get the money. So is there a forum? Is there a place where organizations that have done this successfully and have track record, and where other nonprofits who maybe have never done this before can learn how to approach this and how to do better from those that have already been successful?
I would give the quick pitch in Pennsylvania to say, for Pennsylvania, we have PCA, the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, where a lot, I wouldn't say a lot, but there are groups that have worked with schools in this situation. And I don't know that there would necessarily be a clearinghouse here. But your point is well taken, that you don't want to have, all these organizations lining up and knocking on the door and saying, here's the plan. So I think part of it comes from an established relationship with the arts educators is really, really crucial to making these connections happen. Dustin, any thoughts?
Well, John, as you know, we don't have something quite as robust or clear cut in Arizona. We have had several nonprofits that have attended our sessions from the department to educate about, what Title IV-A is, similar to the sessions that you've attended. And they have been successful in building those relationships with districts. I think a lot of times, one of the biggest hurdles at the local level is finding out whom at the district you need to talk to. That's the biggest challenge. Because a lot of times, the person who's actually writing the grant, the federal programs director, is not a programmatic person. They have no idea what they're actually inputting into the grant. They're just the person that types it up, make sure that it's in the format that we require that meets the state and federal requirements, but they're not the actual programmatic person. So finding that right person oftentimes means building that relationship with the districts. It might mean reaching out directly to your Title IV-A state representative. I can't speak for every single state, but I know in Arizona, when nonprofits reach out to my office and my staff, we have no problem linking them to district contacts. We have no problem walking them through how to access these funds. I will literally show you how to get into district needs assessments. So I think Mark kind of hit it on the head there. It's all relational, and it does, John, as you know, it requires a lot of work.
So any other questions? One last call.
Okay, I'm Sister Loretta Lynn Salata. I teach at Archbishop Ryan High School in Northeast Philadelphia. Okay, so that's a non-public school. I think you've explained that our allotment from ESSA and ESSER come from the Philadelphia School District. Am I correct about that? And how much of it? Is there a percentage, or what is allotted to our non-public schools?
So the non-public share is, if that is the school that you are within the boundaries of, then yes, that's how it's done. And Dustin, do you know what is the formula for how that?
Yeah, I could maybe address this a little bit more, Sister. So depending on the funding source, it's all going to be a little bit different. I'll speak to Title IV because that's sort of my wheelhouse. So your school would be eligible to receive a percentage of Title IV-A funding based off of district geography. So what that means is if your school is within a LEA's boundaries or a district's boundaries, your students are automatically eligible to receive a percentage of the district's Title IV-A allocation. So let's imagine that your school is located on Main Street in Bethany, and it's in the boundaries of 3 different public school districts. You would, in theory, be eligible to receive funding in Title IV-A from all 3 of those districts. Now, the district is responsible and required to consult with you. It's called meaningful consultation, and it should be happening continuously and ongoing. It's important to remember that these funds, while your students are eligible to receive them, the funds themselves are the district's funds. So they are the keeper of the money. Your school is never going to directly see the funds. It's not like they're going to write you a check, but they are required to provide services to those students through that consultation process. And it's based off of, it's a complicated formula, but it is based off of your total school's enrollment. It's a little bit different for Title I. And my biggest recommendation for you would be to contact your state Department of Education, because we are required to have what's called a district's a private school ombudsman. And that person should be able to answer any and all of your questions, because that is a requirement, a federal requirement, that there be an ombudsman on staff at the state level to help you ensure that your students are receiving their equitable share.
Okay, some of our students, most of our students come from the Philadelphia School District, but we do have students coming from Ben Salem, Neshaminy, the Council Rock District. Does that mean we get funding from those two, or does it depend on where the school is, which is in the School District of Philadelphia?
So for Title IV, it sounds like you would only be eligible to receive funding from the Philadelphia School District. And I don't know your geography, but it is based off of geographical location. Now for Title I, that is based off of the student's residence. So you should be receiving an equitable share from all of those districts that you mentioned for your Title I students. That's why I mean it's a little bit different, and your ombudsman will really be able to help you with that.
Okay, thank you.
And I also would imagine there is somebody already in your school that is talking with these districts, because there's no possible way that they're not taking advantage of that money. You might not know exactly where that money is going at this point, but if you can get to that administrative position who's doing that, that is another also avenue I'd suggest.
Thank you.
So Mark, there is a question in the chat that just popped up.
All right. Just wanted to clarify if it might be possible for a nonprofit to directly work with a district, or do schools need to reach out to districts to bring our programming? I think that means, or do nonprofits need to reach out to districts to bring our programming? So from my perspective, I would say that the nonprofit can work right with the district or right with the school. The funding is going to come from the LEA, from the school district, paying the nonprofit for whatever it is that you're providing. Any other questions? So again, you have our emails. I will put this back up there again. If you have any other questions for me or for Dustin, feel free to send them, and we will be happy to do our best to answer them or point you certainly in the right direction. We will post the video of this tomorrow, and we will send the link to all of you. So please feel free to share it around. Thank you all so much for attending.
Thanks, Mark, for having me. Have a wonderful evening,
Great.
everybody.
Thanks for being here.